something far stranger was actually happening to Stonehenge. Real researchers, using real forensic science, some of it genuinely powered by machine learning, have spent the last 2 years quietly rewriting what we know about this monument. And what they actually found is, in some ways, harder to explain than the fake version. By the end of this video, you'll know something about Stonehenge that almost nobody in this country has heard, involving a 6-ton stone that crossed the sea, a population that vanished almost overnight, and a piece of the monument that spent 60 years sitting in a house in Florida. Before we get into the evidence, if real research told well is your thing, no filler, no fake AI mystery content, hit subscribe now, because we've got a lot of ground to cover and it only gets stranger from here. Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain in southern England, and it has been standing in one form or another for about 5,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramid of Giza. It predates written language in Britain by thousands of years. And despite 3 centuries of formal study, we still don't fully agree on why it was built, who exactly built it, or how they managed to move stones weighing many tons across distances that would challenge modern engineering. For most of that time, our best tools for studying it were shovels, tape measures, and guesswork. That changed dramatically in the last 5 years, as archaeologists brought in geochemistry, isotope forensics, ground-penetrating radar, and yes, machine learning to re-examine evidence that had been sitting in archives for decades. Here's something that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Stonehenge was not built as a single project. It was built, torn apart, and rebuilt across roughly 1,500 years, in at least 3 or 4 distinct phases. It started around 3000 BC as a fairly simple circular ditch and bank, a henge, with a ring of 56 pits around its inside edge, now known as the Aubrey Holes, named after the 17th century antiquarian who first noticed them. Some researchers believe those original pits held either timber posts or the very first bluestones brought from Wales, centuries before the giant sarcens most people picture ever arrived on site. The famous horseshoe of trilithons, the huge paired uprights with lintels balanced on top, wasn't added until around 2500 BC. Even after that, the bluestones were dug up and rearranged at least twice more over the following centuries. In other words, the Stonehenge you see today is closer to a heavily renovated building that changed floor plans across 60 generations than it is to a single monument raised in one great effort. Let's start with the one place where AI genuinely does enter this story. Back in 2011 and 2012, a team laser scanned every visible stone at Stonehenge, capturing millions of data points across their surfaces. Buried in that data, they found something remarkable: carvings. Dozens of small, shallow engravings of Bronze Age axe heads, and at least one carving of a dagger cut into the sarsen stone sometime around 1800 BC. That's worth pausing on. The stones themselves went up around 2300 BC. So, these carvings were added roughly 500 years after Stonehenge was built, by people for whom the monument was already ancient history, in the same way the Colosseum is ancient history to us today. In 2025, a research team went back to that decade-old laser scan data with a new set of tools. They trained a machine learning model, a neural network, to recognize carving shapes, even in areas of stone covered by lichen, which normally hides fine surface detail from the naked eye. When they reran the analysis, the algorithm didn't just confirm the old carvings. On a single stone, it flagged 2 carvings nobody had ever recorded before, 10 more possible carved areas that need further study, and it reinterpreted 9 carvings that earlier surveys had gotten wrong. This is the real story behind the phrase "reanalyzed by AI." Not a hidden code, not a buried spiral, a machine learning model finding faint Bronze Age graffiti that human eyes had missed for over a decade, even while staring directly at the data. And that's just the surface of the stones. The real bombshells came from what's inside them. At the very center of Stonehenge lies a large flat slab called the altar stone. It's partly buried, partly hidden under two collapsed sarsens, and for over a century, geologists assumed it came from the same region in Wales as the smaller bluestones nearby. In 2024, a team of geochemists decided to actually test that assumption properly. They examined microscopic mineral grains inside two fragments of the altar stone, tiny crystals of zircon, apatite, and rutile, each of which acts like a fingerprint, because their age and chemical makeup depend entirely on exactly where and when the rock they came from originally formed, hundreds of millions of years ago. When the team analyzed those fingerprints, they didn't match Wales at all. They matched a very specific geological formation called the Orcadian Basin, in the far northeast of Scotland, on the doorstep of Orkney. The altar stone had travelled somewhere over 750 kilometres to reach Salisbury Plain. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the driving distance from New York City to Cincinnati. Except there were no roads, no wheels in use for this kind of transport, and the stone weighs about 6 tons. Researchers now believe it almost certainly went by sea, hugging the coastline in some kind of boat or raft, because the overland route crosses genuinely mountainous terrain that would have been even harder to cross than water at the time. Nobody has found the boat. Nobody has found the route. We just have the stone sitting in the middle of England with a geological passport that says Scotland. What makes this find so significant isn't just the distance, it's what it implies. To move a stone that size that far, you need coordination between communities spread across almost the entire length of Britain, which suggests Stonehenge wasn't a local project at all. It may have been something closer to a shared national effort, built by connecting cultures that lived hundreds of miles apart, at a time when we tend to assume people rarely travelled more than a few days from home. For decades, there was a competing theory that tried to make this entire transport problem disappear. What if humans didn't move the stones at all? What if ancient glaciers had done the work millions of years earlier, dragging boulders from Wales and Scotland and dumping them naturally near Salisbury Plain, where Neolithic builders simply found them lying around, ready to use? It's a tidy explanation, because it removes the need to explain any long-distance human transport whatsoever. In January of 2026, researchers from Curtin University in Australia put that theory to a direct test. If glaciers really had carried these rocks across Britain, they would have left a very specific trace behind. Eroded mineral grains scattered through the river sediment near Stonehenge, grains that could be dated and matched back to Scotland or Wales. So, the team went looking for that exact evidence in the sand and silt of local rivers. They found nothing. No glacial mineral signature at all. Which means the glacier theory, the version of events that lets humans off the hook, simply doesn't hold up. The stones didn't arrive by accident. Somebody moved them, on purpose, across hundreds of miles of Neolithic Britain, with no wheels, no metal tools, and no written plans of any kind. So, if the small blue stones came from Wales and the altar stone came from Scotland, what about the giant sarsens, the massive standing stones that most people picture when they think of Stonehenge, some of them weighing over 20 tons? For over 300 years, the leading guess was the Marlborough Downs, a stretch of countryside about 20 miles from the site. Nobody could prove it, because sarsen stone is notoriously difficult to chemically fingerprint. Then, in an odd twist, the breakthrough came from Florida. Back in 1958, engineers repairing a cracked sarsen stone at Stonehenge drilled 3 narrow cores straight through it to insert supporting rods. One of the workers on that job, a man named Robert Phillips, quietly kept one of the extracted stone cores as a souvenir. He carried it with him as he emigrated to the United States, moving from job to job, state to state, eventually settling in Florida, with a nearly 4-foot cylinder of Stonehenge sitting in his office the entire time. For 60 years, nobody at Stonehenge knew where that piece had gone. Then in 2018, as Phillips approached his 90th birthday, he decided it needed to go home. His sons flew it back to England and handed it over to English Heritage, the organisation that manages the site. And because that particular core had spent 6 decades indoors, untouched by wind, rain, or centuries of weathering, it gave scientists something they had never had before: a perfectly preserved, unweathered cross-section of an actual Stonehenge sarsen. Researchers used it, alongside portable X-ray scanners run across the standing stones themselves, to perform detailed chemical comparisons against sarsen outcrops all across southern England. 20 different sarsen sites, stretching from Norfolk down to Devon, were tested and ruled out one by one before a single match emerged. In 2020, the results came back. The primary source was a place called Westwoods, a patch of forest in Wiltshire, about 15 miles from Stonehenge. 3 centuries of debate, largely settled because a diamond cutter in Florida had a guilty conscience. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and where you start to see real science correcting itself in real time, which is something the fake AI videos never show you, because it's messier than a clean revelation. In 2021, a team led by archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson was excavating a hillside site in West Wales called Warn Morn, close to the quarries where Stonehenge's bluestones originally came from. What they found looked remarkable: a ring of stone holes, the exact same diameter as the ditch surrounding Stonehenge. One of those holes even had a distinctive pentagonal cross-section that matched, almost perfectly, one specific stone still standing at Stonehenge today. The circle also lined up with the midsummer solstice sunrise, just like Stonehenge does. The implication was enormous. What if Stonehenge wasn't originally built in England at all? What if a complete stone circle had first been raised in Wales, then deliberately dismantled, dragged nearly 200 miles, and rebuilt on Salisbury Plain? For a while, this was reported almost as settled fact: the original Stonehenge finally found. But archaeologists kept digging, literally. When they geochemically tested the leftover stone chippings inside those empty holes at Warn Morn, the mineral signatures didn't match Stonehenge's actual bluestones. They pointed instead to a different nearby quarry that Stonehenge's builders apparently never used. The most likely conclusion now is that few, if any, of the missing Warn Morn stones actually ended up at Stonehenge. So, was it all a coincidence? A circle in Wales that just happened to share a diameter and an alignment with a monument 200 miles away? Maybe. Or maybe there's still an undiscovered piece of this puzzle sitting in the Preseli Hills waiting for someone to find it. Even the researchers who found it admit they don't fully know, and that kind of honesty is something you will never see in a fabricated AI mystery video, because uncertainty doesn't get clicks the same way a fake revelation does. And Wales isn't the only place bluestones have turned up unexpectedly. In 2009, archaeologists excavating just half a mile from Stonehenge, right where the ceremonial avenue meets the River Avon, uncovered the base of another, smaller stone circle, now nicknamed Blue Stonehenge. Radiocarbon dating placed it around 3000 BC, roughly contemporary with Stonehenge's earliest phase. The stones themselves were long gone by the time archaeologists got there, but the stone holes left behind matched the size of bluestones, not the much larger sarsens. The leading theory is that this smaller circle once held some of the very same bluestones now standing at Stonehenge, before they were dug up and moved that final half-mile to their current position. So, these particular stones weren't just dragged once from Wales and set down for good. Some of them appear to have been rearranged, relocated, and rebuilt across this landscape multiple times over the course of 1,000 years, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone hoping for one tidy explanation. If this culture kept moving and rebuilding these specific stones for centuries, what exactly made them so important that they were worth moving again and again, instead of simply being replaced with something closer to hand? While geologists were tracing the stones, other researchers turned their attention to the people. Excavations in the 1920s at Stonehenge recovered the cremated remains of up to 58 individuals, buried in a ring of pits called the Aubrey Holes, making Stonehenge one of the largest known late Neolithic burial sites in Britain, a fact that almost never comes up when people talk about it purely as a monument rather than a graveyard. For decades, it was nearly impossible to figure out where these people had actually lived, because cremation destroys the tooth enamel that scientists normally use to trace someone's geographic origin through strontium isotopes. In 2018, researchers developed a new method to extract strontium signatures directly from cremated bone itself. What they found was striking. At least 10 of the 25 individuals tested, a minimum of 40%, had not spent their final years anywhere near Stonehenge. Their isotope signatures pointed most strongly toward West Wales, the exact region the bluestones came from. Some of them appear to have been cremated somewhere else entirely and then carried to Stonehenge afterward, likely wrapped or contained in some kind of bag, based on burial patterns first noted by excavators almost a century ago. So, Stonehenge wasn't just built with stones from Wales. It may have been, at least in part, a burial ground for people from Wales, transported hundreds of miles after death to be laid to rest at the centre of what was becoming the most important ritual site in Britain. 2 miles from Stonehenge sits another site called Durrington Walls, long known as a massive Neolithic enclosure, essentially a giant settlement where the people who built Stonehenge likely lived and feasted. In 2020, a geophysical survey team scanning the ground around Durrington Walls picked up something nobody expected. A ring of enormous circular pits surrounding the entire site, some over 30 feet across and 16 feet deep, arranged in a rough circuit roughly 1.25 miles in diameter. That is larger than Stonehenge itself, larger than almost any other prehistoric structure known in Britain. At first, some researchers wondered if these were simply natural sinkholes in the chalk bedrock. It took years of follow-up work, more geophysical scanning, borehole drilling, and laboratory dating to settle the question properly. In late 2025, a confirmed study concluded that at least 16 of these massive pits were deliberately dug by people, not carved by nature, forming a genuine engineered ring around Durrington Walls. Nobody fully knows what they were for. Some researchers think they may have marked a symbolic boundary, a way of defining sacred space around the site where the builders lived, echoing the same kind of cosmological planning visible at Stonehenge itself. What's remarkable is how recent this discovery is. This isn't some Victorian-era find you learned about in a textbook. Britain's largest known prehistoric monument was confirmed as verified fact within the last several months, and most people have never heard of it. Let's talk about what Stonehenge actually sounded like, because this is one of the more overlooked pieces of research, and it comes from an unusual source: acoustic engineers, not archaeologists. A team at the University of Salford built a scale model of the complete monument, 1/12 the real size, using 3-dimensional printing and laser scan data to recreate all 157 stones that would have stood there around 2200 BC. Including the many that are now missing or collapsed. They nicknamed it Mini-Henge. Then they tested it inside a sound chamber, sending calibrated pitches through it at 12 times normal frequency to compensate for the smaller scale, and measuring how sound behaved inside the ring versus outside it. Here's what they found. Sound reverberated noticeably longer inside the circle of stones than outside it, meaning speech and music would have been audibly amplified and enriched for anyone standing within the ring. But here's the detail that almost never gets mentioned. That amplification only worked for people inside. Because the outer stones blocked direct line of sight and direct sound, anyone standing outside the circle, in a crowd, would have heard something muffled and indistinct. This tells us something important about how Stonehenge likely functioned. It wasn't designed like a stage, built to project a performance out to a large audience. It was built more like a private chamber, an intimate, exclusive acoustic space where whatever happened inside was meant to stay inside, for a select few, while everyone else on the plain outside was deliberately kept in the dark, literally and acoustically. You've probably heard at some point that Stonehenge is essentially a giant stone calendar. This claim gets repeated constantly in documentaries, in trivia, in casual conversation, almost always presented as settled fact. It comes from a 2022 paper by archaeologist Timothy Darvell. who proposed that the 30 stones of the outer Sarsen circle each represent one day of a 30-day month, that the 10 stones of the inner horseshoe represent 5 extra days added at year's end, and that 4 outlying stones mark leap years, altogether forming a precise 365 and a quarter day solar calendar, structurally similar to one later used in ancient Egypt. It's an elegant theory. It is also disputed by other specialists in the field. A mathematician and an astronomer published a direct rebuttal, arguing that Stonehenge shows no clear representation of 12 months anywhere in its actual structure, and that Darwell's interpretation leans heavily on numerology and comparisons to unrelated cultures rather than direct physical evidence at the site itself. Their position isn't that Stonehenge has nothing to do with the sun. The solstice alignment is real and undeniable. Their argument is narrower, that going from "this monument tracks the solstice" to "this monument is a precision 365-day calendar" is a much bigger leap than the popular version of the story usually admits. So, the next time you hear someone state, with total confidence, that Stonehenge is a calendar, know that inside the field of archaeology, that claim is still very much an open argument, not a closed case. Now, for the part of this story that I think is genuinely the most extraordinary, and it has nothing to do with stones at all. It has to do with the people. Around 2450 BC, not long after the Sarsens went up in their current arrangement, something happened across Britain that ancient DNA research has only been able to detect within the last several years. A new population began arriving from continental Europe, a group archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture, named for their distinctive pottery style. Genetic studies comparing British skeletons from before and after this period found something almost hard to believe. Within a few centuries, more than 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool in Britain, the DNA of the people who built Stonehenge and the other great megalithic monuments, was replaced. Not culturally influenced, not gradually blended over many generations. Replaced. The male lineages of the original population were almost entirely supplanted. The newcomers even looked physically different, carrying genes for lighter skin and blue eyes, compared to the darker-skinned, dark-eyed, dark-haired population that had lived in Britain for thousands of years before them. Researchers still don't agree on exactly why this happened so quickly. Whether through disease, conflict, mass migration, or some combination, nobody has fully reconstructed yet. But think about what this actually means. The civilization that conceived Stonehenge, that organized the labor to drag a 6-ton stone from Scotland and 20-ton stones from Wiltshire, that built the largest prehistoric pit circle in Britain right next door, essentially vanished from the genetic record within a handful of generations after finishing their masterpiece. Most people walking around Britain today are not the direct descendants of the people who built Stonehenge. They are descendants of the people who arrived afterward, inheriting a monument whose original meaning had already, in a very real sense, died along with its builders. To put a human face on that genetic story, consider a single grave discovered by accident in 2002, just a few miles from Stonehenge, during construction work for a new school. Inside was a man archaeologist nicknamed the Amesbury Archer, buried around 2300 BC with an extraordinary collection of grave goods for the period. 5 beaker pots, 18 arrowheads, 2 archers' wrist guards, 3 copper knives, and a pair of gold hair ornaments, among the earliest gold objects ever found in Britain. Oxygen and strontium isotope analysis of his teeth showed he hadn't grown up in Britain at all. He had spent his childhood far away, in the Alpine region of Central Europe, likely modern-day Switzerland, Austria, or Germany, before eventually settling near Stonehenge, where he died in his 40s with a permanent limp from an old knee injury. The press nicknamed him the King of Stonehenge. He was one of the earliest identified Bell Beaker migrants in Britain, and more recent DNA testing has confirmed ancestry tracing back to the steppe populations that reshaped the entire continent around this time. He isn't proof of the population replacement on his own, but he's a real individual person you can point to, buried within a few generations of Stonehenge's final major construction phase, who embodies exactly the migration story the DNA data reveals at a much larger scale. So when you put all of this together, The real Stonehenge story turns out to be more interesting than the fake one currently circulating online, not because of a hidden code or a secret algorithm, but because of what actual science, patiently applied over the last 5 years, has been able to recover from stone, bone, sediment, and sound. A monument built, dismantled, and rebuilt across 15 centuries, starting as a simple ditch and a ring of pits long before a single sarsen arrived. A centre stone carried across the sea from Scotland. A ring of standing stone sourced from a specific forest that took 3 centuries, and a Florida souvenir to finally identify. A satellite circle by the river that may have held some of the same bluestones before they were moved that last half-mile. A possible sister monument in Wales that both confirmed and complicated the story the moment scientists looked closer. A graveyard where nearly half the dead came from hundreds of miles away. A second, even larger prehistoric structure sitting quietly next door, confirmed as real barely months ago. An acoustic design meant to include a few and exclude everyone else. And a population, the actual builders, who were almost completely erased from the genetic record within a few generations of finishing the job. Nobody needed to fake any of this. The real research is stranger than the fiction. If you want more videos like this, ones built entirely on peer-reviewed research and real archaeological data, not recycled AI mystery content, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. The studies behind everything you just heard were published in journals like Nature, Antiquity, Scientific Reports, and Communications, Earth and Environment between 2018 and 2026. So none of this is guesswork, it's the current edge of the field. And if there was a fact in here that genuinely surprised you, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it helps me know exactly what to dig into next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.